She had built a company worth $200 million. She had sat across from senators, closed deals in boardrooms from New York to Chicago, and turned a startup nobody believed in into a name that moved markets. But on a dark Ohio road on a Tuesday night in October, none of that meant a single thing. Her wheelchair was dead. Her phone had one bar and then none. And for 47 minutes, every pair of headlights that appeared on that empty road simply kept going. If this story moves you, hit like and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The battery warning had been blinking on and off since that morning, which was entirely Victoria's fault. She'd noticed it during breakfast, that small amber light on the armrest display, the one she'd been meaning to address for 2 weeks. Her assistant, Miriam, had mentioned it twice. The technician from the mobility services company had called on a Friday and left a voicemail she'd never returned. Victoria had looked at the warning light, told herself she'd deal with it after the afternoon meetings, and then had gone on to have a day that swallowed every intention she'd had before 9 a.m. That was October 14th, a Tuesday. By 7:15 that evening, she was sitting on the shoulder of County Road 17, 8 miles outside of Millhaven, Ohio, in a wheelchair that wouldn't move, in the dark, alone. The chair had given out without drama. There was no grinding sound, no warning vibration, no final dying lurch. It simply stopped. One moment she was rolling forward at her usual pace along the narrow asphalt shoulder. The next, she was sitting completely still, and the motor was quiet, and the display screen had gone from amber to black. She pressed the joystick forward. Nothing. She pressed it again harder, as though pressure could solve electronics. Still nothing. Victoria sat there for a moment with her hands in her lap, looking at the dead panel, and felt the specific, cold kind of clarity that comes when you understand exactly what has happened and exactly how much of it is your own doing. You had a week, she thought. You had 2 weeks. You had 17 voicemails and a blinking light every morning. She reached into the side pouch of her bag and pulled out her phone. 2 bars. Then 1. Then the little icon that meant there was technically a signal, but it was lying to her. She tried calling Miriam. The call connected for 4 seconds and then dropped. She tried again. This time it went straight to something that wasn't quite a dial tone and wasn't quite silence. The road in front of her was 2 lanes, no median, no streetlights. To her left was a shallow drainage ditch, and then a field that went flat and dark all the way to a tree line she could barely see. To her right was more of the same. She had been driven, out this way to visit the Coldwell and Pierce facility, a small manufacturing operation that her company had recently absorbed. And she had asked Marcus, her usual driver, to drop her at the main building while he handled the pickup truck rental they'd arranged for moving equipment. She had told him she would call when she was ready. She had not called when she was ready, because she'd gotten into a long and complicated conversation with the floor manager about union scheduling that she hadn't wanted to cut short. Marcus had texted twice. She'd texted back both times saying she needed 20 more minutes, and then she'd come outside and started back toward the main road on her own, because she needed air, and because she was used to moving, to being in motion, and sometimes the walls of a building she'd just acquired felt like they were closing in. She hadn't told Marcus she was leaving. That had been the second mistake. The battery was the first. Not telling Marcus was the second. She tried to text him now. The message sat in her outbox with a little clock icon next to it, unsent. Victoria put the phone down on her lap and looked at the road. The first car came about 4 minutes later. A pair of headlights coming from the north, high beams cutting through the dull October mist. She raised her arm and waved, not frantically. She was not a person who did things frantically, but clearly, deliberately, the kind of wave that could not be mistaken for someone stretching. The car didn't slow down. It went past her at around 50 miles an hour, close enough that she felt the rush of displaced air, and its taillight shrank down the road and disappeared. She put her arm down. The next car came 6 minutes after that. Same direction. She waved again, this time with more urgency, leaning forward slightly in the chair, her arm high. The car slowed, but she felt a small surge of relief, painful in its immediacy. And then it accelerated again, and was gone. They had seen her. She was almost certain. The slowing had been real. They had seen her and decided not to stop. Victoria looked down at her lap for a moment. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a cream-colored blouse, her hair pulled back in the practical knot she always wore for site visits. She looked like a professional. She was sitting in a power wheelchair on the shoulder of a dark rural road at 7:30 at night, and she looked like a professional, and she had tried to wave down two cars, and both of them had kept going. She thought about what she must look like to a driver passing at 50 miles an hour. Not a CEO, not the founder of Hayes Adaptive Solutions, a company that had grown from a two-room office and a lot of stubbornness into a $30 million operation with clients in 11 states. Not the woman who had sat across a conference table from 3 separate investors who'd tried to lowball her and had refused all of them until she got the terms she needed. Not any of that. She looked like a problem, a complication, something that would take time and involve effort and might not resolve cleanly. She understood. She didn't like it, but she understood it. The temperature had dropped since sundown. October in central Ohio didn't give you a lot of warning. It was 60 degrees and reasonably comfortable at 5 in the afternoon, and by 7:30 it was 43, and the mist had thickened to the point where she could feel it on her face. She had a jacket in her bag, but it was folded underneath her laptop and the site visit binder and everything else she'd packed that morning, and accessing it meant contorting herself in ways that were possible but not simple. She managed it eventually. Got the jacket out, worked it over her arms, got the zipper about 3/4 of the way up before the pull tab slipped from her fingers. She left it like that. It was warm enough. Her phone showed no bars now. Not one. She held it up in different directions the way people do, even though they know it doesn't actually help, watched the signal indicator remain stubbornly empty, and set it back in her lap. She had been on this road for 22 minutes. In that time, 4 more cars had passed. She had waved at 2 of them. Both had continued without slowing. The other 2 she hadn't bothered with. They'd come too fast, at angles that made it clear they weren't going to notice her until they were already past. She was not a person who cried easily. She'd learned a long time ago during the 2 years following the accident that had put her in this chair at age 26, that crying in front of people, and sometimes crying at all, was a kind of signal that certain people interpreted as permission to diminish you, to step in front of you, to make decisions on your behalf. She had trained herself out of it with the grinding patience of someone who understood that the world gave you 2 options: be underestimated or refuse to be. She had chosen the second, but sitting here in the dark and the cold, with the dead chair and the empty road and the clock on her phone reading 7:46, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt small. Not diminished by anyone else, not underestimated or overlooked or condescended to, just small. In the way you sometimes feel small in nature, or in a hospital, or in the moments just before sleep when your thoughts get too honest. Small in the way that the world could make you feel when it was very big and very dark, and you were sitting still in the middle of it. She didn't cry, but she felt it. Whoa! A truck went by going south at 7:51 and didn't stop. A minivan with a broken taillight went by at 8:04 and didn't stop. At 8:11, Victoria tried her phone again and got half a bar long enough to send a text. Not to Marcus, who was probably out of range, but to her own office line, where there was a machine and where Miriam checked messages obsessively. She typed, "Stranded on County Road 17 approximately 8 miles from Mill Haven. Wheelchair dead. Phone signal lost. If you get this, please send someone." She hit send and watched the clock icon appear next to it and stayed with it for almost a minute, hoping. It didn't go through. She put the phone in her jacket pocket this time instead of her lap. Her hands were cold. She folded them together and pressed them between her knees and sat with her back straight, because slouching felt like giving something up. The field to her right had something moving in it. She could hear it, a low rustling that was probably a deer or a groundhog or the wind catching dried corn stalks. It went on for a while and then stopped. The mist had become something close to actual fog. She could see maybe 60 feet down the road in either direction. She was not scared of the dark. She wasn't afraid of animals or of the cold or of being alone in a field. She was afraid of the specific thing that was actually happening. She was stationary, in a place with no infrastructure to help her, and she had no reliable way to change that. The wheelchair was not something she could push by hand. It was a power chair, 40-something pounds, not designed for manual operation, and even if it had been, the roads out here were not built for that. She couldn't walk. That was not a psychological statement or a question of willpower. She could not walk. The accident at 26 had been thorough on that point. What she had was the chair, which didn't work, and the phone, which couldn't call out, and the road, which people were using to go somewhere else. She sat with that. The headlights at OT 19 came from the south, which was different from the previous cars. Those had all come from the north, toward Millhaven. These were coming from the opposite direction, from the direction of the Coldwell and Pierce facility, which meant this driver had presumably come from somewhere further south and was heading into town. She raised her arm. The lights kept coming, not slowing, and she felt the already familiar contraction of hope, the way it collapsed before it had fully arrived, the way you learn to pre-protect yourself. The truck slowed. Not a dramatic brake, not a squeal of tires, just a gradual, deliberate deceleration, the kind that said the driver had seen her from a distance and made a decision. The truck, a dark-colored pickup, she could see that now, older, not new, with a toolbox visible in the bed, pulled over onto the shoulder about 15 feet in front of her, rear tires crunching on gravel. The engine stayed running. The door opened. The man who got out was maybe 30 or so, average height, with the kind of build that came from actual physical work rather than a gym. He was wearing a dark thermal shirt and jeans with grease stains on them, and he moved toward her without hesitating, without the performance of hesitation that some people did, the visible weighing of whether this was their business. He had a flashlight in his hand, not a small one, a real one, the kind kept in trucks for actual emergencies, and he clicked it on as he approached and pointed it slightly to the side of her rather than directly at her face, which she noticed. "Hey," he said when he got close enough. His voice was plain, not loud, not careful. "You okay?" "My wheelchair died," Victoria said. "The battery. I've been here about an hour." He looked at the chair. Not at her, at the chair. He swept the flashlight beam across it with the focused attention of someone trying to understand a mechanical problem. "You called anyone?" "No signal." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own phone, looked at it. "I've got one bar. Sometimes that's enough out here if you text." He looked back at her. "You want me to try?" "I already tried. It didn't go through." She paused. "But you can try again. Different carrier might work." He looked at his phone. AT&T. "Verizon," she said. "Okay." He typed something, waited, watched. His face was tired, but not exhausted, just the end of a long day kind of tired that sat around the eyes and in the way a person held their shoulders. "Sent," he said. "Don't know if it went." "Thank you." He pocketed the phone and crouched down to look at the wheelchair, bringing the flashlight up close to the display panel. He didn't touch it without asking. He said, "Can I?" and gestured toward the armrest. "Go ahead." He looked at the panel, then at the underside of the chair, then at the battery housing. "Power chair," he said, more to himself than to her. "What brand?" "Sterling Advanced, the 720. He made a sound, not quite a word, just a sound that meant he was processing. "I've worked on a couple of these, different context, but..." He stood back up. "Battery's completely dead?" "It died while I was moving, just cut out." "No warning?" She paused. "There was a warning, this morning. I didn't address it." He looked at her briefly. Not with judgment. She would have noticed judgment, was calibrated for it. It was the look of someone who was adjusting their understanding of a situation. "Okay," he said. "Let me look at what I've got in the truck." She watched him walk back to the pickup and open the toolbox in the bed. He had a systematic way of moving through it that suggested familiarity. Not searching, more like checking, the hands going to specific places. He came back with a jump pack, the kind used for car batteries, and a set of cables, and something else she couldn't immediately identify in the low light. "I don't know if this works," he said, squatting down again beside the chair. "Power chairs run off lithium packs usually, not lead acid, but I want to see if there's an auxiliary port." "There is," she said. "Left side panel, under the access flap." He found it. She watched him work, watched his hands moving carefully across the mechanisms of a piece of equipment that was not his and that he had no stake in, watched him treat it with the same care he apparently brought to everything mechanical. He had a small screwdriver out now, doing something with the connection points. "I'm Ryan, by the way," he said without looking up. "Victoria." "You live out here, Victoria?" "No, I was visiting a facility down the road. My driver was supposed to pick me up, but there was a miscommunication." He nodded. "The Coldwell place?" "Yes. I did some work out there last year, brakes on their forklift." He sat back on his heels, examined what he'd done, then reached for the jump pack. "Okay, I want to try running a small charge through the auxiliary port. It won't fix the battery. The battery's dead and you need a replacement, but it might give you enough temporary power to run the motor for a while. Maybe 20 minutes, half hour." He looked at her. "That work for you if it works?" "Yes," she said. "That would work." "Might not work," he said again. "I don't want to oversell this." "I understand." He connected the cables with the methodical attention of someone who did not want to make a mistake. He double-checked the connections, then double-checked them again. He said, "Give it a second," and waited with his hand near the disconnect in case something went wrong. The display panel on the wheelchair flickered, went dark, flickered again, and then it lit up. Thanks. Victoria stared at it for a moment. The amber warning indicator was still there, of course it was, but underneath it, the motor status showed active, and the joystick control light had come on, and the small power bar in the corner of the display was showing a thin sliver of charge. She pushed the joystick forward, very slightly. The chair moved. She let out a breath she'd been holding without knowing it. Not a dramatic sound, just a slow release, the kind that happens when the body acknowledges that a thing you were pretending not to fear is no longer present. "There you go," Ryan said. He was already disconnecting the cables, careful and methodical in reverse. He coiled them and picked up the jump pack. "Like I said, you've got maybe 20 to 30 minutes of power. The auxiliary charge degrades fast on a lithium system. You want to be somewhere by the time it runs out." "I'll drive toward town," she said. "There's more signal closer to Millhaven." He stood, brushing dirt from his knee. "Which direction is town for you?" "North." "I'm going north," he said. "You want me to follow you until you get signal, in case it cuts out again?" She looked at him. He was not offering this as a gesture. He was offering it the way a mechanic offered to follow a car to make sure a repair held, practically, without expectation. "That would be—" "Yes," she said. "If that's not out of your way." "It's not." She reached into her bag. She knew what it looked like before she did it, and she did it anyway, because it was the honest response to what had happened, and because she didn't know another way to express it. She pulled out her wallet and held out 3 bills, folded. She wasn't sure exactly how much, but it was real. "Please let me." He shook his head. He didn't say anything elaborate about it. He just looked at the bills and shook his head and said, "That's all right. You spent half an hour in the cold fixing something that isn't yours." 40 minutes, he said, "but I wasn't keeping track." "I was," she said. "I had nothing else to do but count." Something crossed his face at that. Not pity, nothing she needed to push back against. More like recognition, like he understood something about what 40 minutes of that felt like, and it was not lost on him. "Keep your money," he said. "I've got a daughter at home who thinks I'm a superhero. That's about all the payment I need." Victoria held his gaze for a moment. She had interviewed hundreds of people over the years. She was not a naive reader of character. She had met a lot of people who performed goodness and a much smaller number who were actually in possession of it, and she had learned the difference. She put the money back in her wallet. "Thank you," she said. It came out plainly, without the professional calibration she applied to most things she said. Just the words. "Don't thank me yet," Ryan said. "I said 20 minutes. Let's get you where you're going first." He walked back to his truck and she started moving, slowly at first, then at her normal pace, keeping to the shoulder. His headlight settled in behind her, far enough back to give her space, close enough to be visible. They moved north along County Road 17 with the October mist softening the light and the fields dark on either side. After about 6 minutes, her phone showed 1 bar, then 2. She stopped. Tried Marcus. He answered on the first ring, his voice carrying the particular texture of someone who has been worrying for a while and trying not to show it. "Ms. Hayes, I know," she said. "I'm on County Road 17 about 2 miles south of the junction. My chair is running on borrowed time. I need a pickup in the next 15 minutes. I'm coming. I'm 5 minutes away. I've been driving these roads for 20 minutes. Thank you, Marcus. She ended the call and turned the chair around, rolling back toward Ryan's truck. He had pulled off and was waiting, engine running, window down. I reached my driver, she said. He's 5 minutes out. Ryan nodded. Good. She looked at him through the window. He looked tired, the way she'd noticed before, and there was grease on his forearm and on the side of his neck from work she could only guess at. And he had pulled over on a dark road and spent 40 minutes on his knees in the cold for a stranger without being asked. Your daughter, she said. How old? 7, he said. 8 in February. What's her name? Lily. Victoria nodded. She didn't say anything more for a moment. Behind her, she could see headlights appearing at the far end of the road. Marcus, she was almost certain. I own a company, she said. Hayes Adaptive Solutions. We work in mobility technology and accessibility equipment. If you ever have work we could help with, or if there's something your company does that intersects with ours. She stopped herself. That was the wrong language. That was the boardroom voice, and this was not the place for it. She started again. I'm not very good at this, she said. Accepting help. I've been doing it on my own for a long time, and I'm not good at it. Ryan looked at her steadily. He didn't rush to fill the silence. Thank you, she said again. Not the professional version, the actual version. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, Get home safe, Victoria. Marcus's truck appeared around the bend, slowing as it spotted her, and Ryan waited until he was sure she was accounted for before he put his truck in drive. She watched his taillights move up the road toward Millhaven, grow small, and disappear. She sat in the cold for a moment, in the dark, with the thin sliver of charge still showing on her display and the amber warning light blinking like it always had. And she thought about all the cars that hadn't stopped. She thought about how easy it was to keep going, how natural, how many reasons there were to not get involved. She thought about a man covered in end-of-day grease who had not needed any of those reasons because he hadn't thought about himself long enough to need them. Marcus climbed out of his truck and hurried toward her. Ms. Hayes, I'm so sorry, It's okay, she said, and she meant it, which surprised her a little. Let's just get home. He helped her into the truck cab, folded the wheelchair, and loaded it into the back, and they turned south toward Millhaven with the heater running and the fog coming in gray across the fields on either side. Victoria looked out the window. Somewhere up ahead, a pickup truck was going home to a 7-year-old girl who believed her father was a superhero. She thought, she isn't wrong. Marcus didn't say much on the drive back. He was good at that, knowing when silence was more useful than words, which was one of the reasons Victoria had kept him on for 4 years, despite 2 separate attempts by her CFO to reduce the transportation budget. She sat in the passenger seat with the heat running and her hands folded in her lap and watched the fog-blurred headlights of oncoming cars appear and dissolve, and she didn't say much either. The wheelchair was in the back, dead and folded, taking up space the way broken things did. She'd have to call the mobility service in the morning. She'd have to explain to Miriam why she hadn't called in the first voicemail cycle. She'd have to do a lot of explaining, to a lot of people, starting with herself. The facility okay? Marcus asked, about 10 minutes in. Neutral ground, something work-related. The facility's fine, she said. The floor manager is resistant but not unreasonable. We'll get there. He nodded and didn't push it. She looked at her phone. The text she'd sent from the roadside had gone through. She could see the delivered notification now that she had signal. Miriam had also called 3 times and sent 2 texts, the most recent of which read, Please just tell me you're not dead. Victoria typed back, Not dead. On my way home. Sorry for the delay. She stared at the word sorry for a second, then left it. She was not usually sorry about her decisions. She made them, owned the consequences, and moved forward. That was the architecture of how she operated. But tonight had a different quality to it, and she wasn't ready to examine exactly what that quality was. She closed her eyes for the last 10 minutes of the drive and did not sleep. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Millhaven that had been renovated 6 years ago to meet accessibility standards, mostly. The elevator was reliable 4 days out of 5. The doorways were wide enough, and the bathroom had been custom fitted at her own expense when she'd signed the lease. It was not a perfect setup, but it was hers, and she had stopped expecting perfect setups in the years since the accident had clarified what the world was actually built for and what it was not. Marcus helped her up and made sure she was in before he left, which she allowed because she was tired and the chair's borrowed charge had run out completely somewhere around the building's entrance. She'd had to transfer to the manual backup chair she kept in the lobby storage, a smaller, lighter version she used for emergencies, which felt exactly like what it was, a backup plan, less than ideal, functional. She got inside, got the lights on, sat in the kitchen with the overhead fluorescents humming and a glass of water she wasn't drinking, and thought about a man named Ryan Walker who had 40 minutes of his evening and had given them without being asked. She thought about Lily, who was 8 in February. She thought about the amber warning light she'd ignored for 2 weeks. She was not given to self-pity, had genuinely cauterized that particular response sometime around age 28 when she'd realized it was the most expensive emotion she could afford. But there was a version of this night's inventory that was uncomfortable to take. The number of cars that had passed, the specific quality of sitting still and watching them go, the way her professional identity, the whole carefully constructed structure of competence and authority she moved through the world with, had been exactly 0% useful for 47 minutes on a dark Ohio road. She drank the water, rinsed the glass, went to bed. Months. Ryan got home at 8:53. He knew the exact time because Lily's sitter, a retired school teacher named Doris Hartwell, who lived 3 houses down and charged $15 an hour and was worth significantly more, met him at the door with her coat already on and her purse in hand and said, "She went down at 8:30, and I need to get home because my program starts at 9. Doris watched a crime procedural every Tuesday that she took with the seriousness of a standing appointment, and Ryan had learned early on not to interfere with it. "Sorry, Doris, ran into something on the road." She gave him the look she reserved for explanations she didn't require. "There's soup on the stove, the good kind, not the can." She meant she'd made it herself, which happened about twice a month, and which Lily talked about for days afterward. "Eat something. You look like you've been run through a fence." "Thank you, Doris." She was already down the porch steps. He locked the door and stood in the front hallway for a moment, in the quiet of a house that was asleep except for the refrigerator hum and the sound of the upstairs heater cycling on, and he let the day settle. It had been a long one. 2 brake jobs, a transmission that turned out to be worse than the estimate, a parts delivery that showed up 3 hours late, and then the drive back along County Road 17 because the highway was backed up from an accident near the interchange. He hadn't planned to stop. He hadn't been in a condition to stop. He was tired, he was hungry, he smelled like a shop, and all he had wanted was to get home before Lily went to bed so he could hear about her day. But he'd seen her from far enough away that there was no pretending he hadn't. A woman alone on the shoulder of a dark road in a wheelchair that wasn't moving. And the thing was, he'd driven past people before. Everyone had. You made the calculation about safety, about time, about whether you were the right person for whatever the situation was. He'd driven past people, but not someone like that. Not on a road like that, in the dark, alone. He'd pulled over before he'd consciously decided to. He got a bowl of Doris's soup, chicken and something rich and thick, and sat at the kitchen table with his work boots still on because he was too tired to take them off, and ate standing up for a minute before he remembered there was a chair right there and sat down. He thought about Victoria, the way she'd looked when the wheelchair came back on. Not dramatic, not tearful, just that one breath. The way she'd held money out to him like it was the only language she was certain they shared. The way she'd taken it back without making it awkward. He'd met people with money before. Some of them were fine and some of them weren't, same as anyone else. But there was something about her that struck him as genuinely unpolished in a way that felt like honesty. Not practiced humility, not the performed modesty of someone who wanted credit for being relatable. More like a person who was used to having every resource at her disposal except the specific one she'd needed that night, and who'd had to sit with that for 47 minutes without any way to fix it. He finished the soup, rinsed the bowl, went upstairs. He stopped at Lily's door, which was cracked open the way she liked it, and looked in. She was asleep on her side with her arm around a stuffed rabbit she'd named Gerald for reasons she'd never fully explained. The nightlight threw a soft yellow circle on the wall above her bed. She was breathing slow and even, and her hair was in a braid that had mostly come undone, and she looked entirely peaceful in the way that only children sleeping could manage. Ryan stood in the doorway for maybe 30 seconds. Then he went to his own room, took off his boots, and was asleep before he'd finished deciding to be. He was up at 5:40, which was usual. He had to be at the shop by 7:30, and the morning routine with Lily took exactly as long as it took, which was always longer than he planned for. She was not a morning person, a trait she had apparently inherited from her mother, a woman Ryan had loved in his early 20s with the kind of total commitment that only young people managed, and who had left when Lily was 2 years old for reasons that had seemed insufficient at the time and that Ryan had mostly stopped trying to adjudicate. Claire was in Portland now. She called Lily on birthdays and sometimes Christmas, which was enough for Lily to have a vague, positive association with the name Mom, and not enough for Ryan to feel she'd been shortchanged in any meaningful way. Lily had Doris, and she had Ryan, and she had her teacher, Mrs. Kim, and her best friend, a girl named Sophie, who lived 2 streets over. She was fine. Ryan told himself this regularly and mostly believed it. He made coffee, made Lily's lunch, peanut butter sandwich, apple slices, the crackers she'd been obsessed with for 3 weeks. A note he tucked into the side pocket because she'd told him once that it was her favorite part of lunchtime and he'd never stopped doing it. He heard her alarm go off upstairs at 6:15, heard the specific thump that meant she'd turned it off with more force than necessary, and then silence for 4 minutes before she appeared at the top of the stairs in her pajamas, hair completely destroyed from sleep, squinting at the kitchen light. "Morning," he said. She made a sound that was not a word. "Pancakes or eggs?" She held up one finger. "Pancakes." "You have to actually wake up before you can have pancakes." She sat down on the bottom stair and put her chin in her hands and looked at him with the expression of someone who found the concept of waking up personally offensive. He made the pancakes. She came around by the time she'd eaten 2 of them, which was always how it went. By 6:40 she was talking, asking him about his day yesterday, whether he'd fixed the transmission, had he driven past any animals on the road. She asked about animals because she was in a phase where she cataloged wildlife sightings and kept a notebook about it with drawings that were impressionistic but enthusiastic. "I didn't see any animals," he said, "but I stopped to help someone whose wheelchair broke down." Lily looked at him over her pancake. "Like a real wheelchair?" "Yeah, power chair. Battery died." "Did you fix it?" "Sort of. I got it running enough to work for a while. She needed to get to where there was cell service." Lily considered this with the serious expression she brought to information she was filing. "Was she scared?" Ryan thought about it. "I think so. She didn't show it, but yeah, I think she was." "That's bad," Lily said. "Being scared and not being able to show it." He looked at his daughter, 8 years old in February. "Yeah," he said. "It is." Lily nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to her pancakes. She had a way of cutting through things that Ryan found alternately heartening and disarming. She'd been doing it since she was 4, when she'd told him during a difficult week, with complete matter-of-factness, that it was okay to be sad sometimes because it meant you cared about things. He'd thought about that sentence more times than he could count. He dropped her at school at 7:15, watched her run toward the entrance without looking back the way she always did. She'd never been a prolonged goodbye person, which he appreciated, and headed to the shop. Walker Automotive was not a large operation. It was a 2-bay garage on Carmichael Street that Ryan had taken over from his Uncle Pete 4 years ago, when Pete had decided that 63 was old enough to stop getting under cars for a living. The shop had a decent reputation, a small but consistent customer base, and exactly the kind of financial stability that looked fine on paper and meant something very different when the compressor broke down, or a supplier raised their prices, or a slow month hit without warning. Ryan had one full-time employee, a guy named Derek Oakes, who was 24, excellent with engines, and deeply unreliable about anything involving paperwork. He had one part-time person, a high schooler named Tomas, who came in 3 afternoons a week and was learning faster than Derek had at the same age, which Ryan did not say out loud. He got to the shop at 7:20, changed into his work shirt, and was under the transmission car from yesterday by 7:35. Derek came in at 8, ate a breakfast sandwich over the parts catalog, and started on a brake job without being asked, which was a good sign. Tomas wasn't in until 4. It was a normal Wednesday morning. Ryan worked and listened to the same classic rock station he always had on and thought, periodically, about the night before. Not about Victoria specifically, about the things she'd said near the end. I'm not very good at this. Accepting help. He'd heard versions of that before from people, and it usually meant something self-deprecating said for effect, the kind of thing that was really a way of saying, look how self-sufficient I am. But she'd said it differently, like it was an actual diagnosis, like she was reporting something about herself she'd observed clinically and wasn't entirely happy about. He didn't know what her life was like beyond what she'd told him, that she ran a company, that she'd had a driver, that she'd been at the Coldwell facility. He didn't know what kind of years it had taken to get to a place where accepting help felt like a language she'd lost fluency in, but he thought about the amber warning light she'd mentioned and the way she'd said I didn't address it, not deflecting, not making an excuse, just stating it flat. And he thought, whatever she's built, she built it mostly alone, and she's been paying for that in ways she probably doesn't talk about. He knew something about that. He went back to the transmission. Numped. At 11:15, his phone buzzed. Unknown number, Ohio area code, not one he recognized. He answered anyway because sometimes customers called from phones that weren't in his contacts. Ryan Walker? Yeah. This is Victoria Hayes. A pause, short. From last night. He sat up from under the car. Hey, you get home okay? I did. My driver found me about 10 minutes after you left. Another pause, this one slightly different in quality. I wanted to call and check whether you got home all right. I realize that sounds strange given that you were the one helping me. But I didn't ask you last night, and I thought about it afterward. Ryan wiped his hand on the shop rag hanging from his belt. I'm fine. Got home a little late, but nothing dramatic. Good. She paused again. She paused in a way that suggested she was someone who chose words carefully and sometimes needed a moment to find them. I also wanted to say that I gave you the professional version of thank you last night because that's the version I have more practice with. I've been thinking about it since and I wanted to give you the actual version. Ryan didn't say anything for a second. Okay, he said. I've been on my own for a long time, Victoria said. I don't mean that as a complaint. I chose most of it. But last night was a specific kind of hard. The kind that doesn't care about anything you've built or how capable you are. It just puts you somewhere and says, well, now what? And I was sitting there thinking about how many cars had gone by, and then you stopped. She stopped herself. He could hear her draw a breath. I'm not telling you this to make you feel important. I'm telling you because I wasn't sure I said it clearly enough, and I think it mattered, and I didn't want to leave it partial. Ryan was sitting on the creeper seat, the concrete floor of the shop cold through his work pants, Derek moving around somewhere in the next bay, the radio playing something from the 90s. You said it fine last night, he said. Maybe, but I wasn't sure. A brief pause. I called the mobility service this morning about the battery. They're coming Friday. Make sure they check the secondary cell connection while they're at it. Sometimes when the primary drains that fast, there's a draw issue in the secondary. A beat. Are you giving me wheelchair maintenance advice? Just passing it along. You've repaired power chairs before? Once or twice. Old model, different setup, but similar enough. Hayes Adaptive Solutions makes mobility equipment, she said. Among other things. I've spent 4 years learning about this technology from the inside, and the mechanic who jump-started my chair in a field is giving me maintenance tips. It's not a complicated tip. No, she said, but it's a useful one. There was something in her voice that he couldn't fully read. Not quite amusement, not quite something else. Like she was recalibrating something. I'm going to let you get back to work. I wanted to say it properly. I'm glad you did, he said. And he was, which surprised him a little. Take care of yourself, Ryan. You too. The call ended. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment, then tucked it in his pocket and rolled back under the car. Derek appeared at the bay entrance. Who was that? Someone I helped last night. Helped how? Wheelchair broke down on County Road 17, Battery. Derek considered this. And they called to say thanks? Yeah. Huh. Derek went back to his brake job. Then, from around the corner, that doesn't happen very often. No, Ryan said, staring up at the underside of the transmission. Doesn't. But that afternoon, Lily came home from school with a drawing she'd done during free period. She put it on the kitchen table in front of Ryan while he was going through the shop's invoices. A stack of papers he brought home twice a week because the office at the shop was too small and too loud to think in. The drawing showed a man next to a truck. Next to the man was a person in a wheelchair. There were stars around the edges, which was Lily's standard decoration for things she considered important. The man in the drawing had what appeared to be a wrench in his hand, though it could also have been a fish. Is that from what I told you this morning? Ryan asked. She was scared and didn't show it, Lily said, with the gravity of a fact that had stayed with her all day. So I drew the part where she wasn't scared anymore. Ryan looked at the drawing. The wheelchair person had a smile drawn on them, small, deliberate, the careful kind children drew when they wanted to make sure it counted. That's good, Lil, he said. She took the drawing back and went to put it on the refrigerator, where she kept the things she considered important. He watched her stick it up between a school photo and a drawing of Gerald the rabbit. He went back to the invoices, but he kept thinking about the smile in the drawing, small and careful, and about a woman on a dark road counting minutes, and about the way she'd said the actual version, like the professional version was a translation she'd been making for so long, she almost forgot there was an original underneath. He finished the invoices, made dinner, helped Lily with a worksheet about state capitals that she found inexplicably outrageous, and told her goodnight. She said, I hope the wheelchair lady is okay. She is, he said. She called today. Lily nodded, satisfied. Good. She seemed like someone who needed things to be okay. Ryan turned off her light. He stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the house settle around him the way old houses did in October, the walls contracting in the cold, the particular creak of the third stair, all the ordinary sounds of a life that wasn't glamorous or remarkable by any measure he could see from the inside. He thought, most lives aren't, from the inside. He went downstairs and sat on the couch with the television off, and in the quiet he let himself acknowledge something he hadn't quite let himself acknowledge yet, that the call from Victoria Hayes had stayed with him in a way that had nothing to do with the wheelchair or the tools or the technical problem he'd solved on the shoulder of a dark road. It had stayed with him because of the way she'd said the actual version, like the act of calling a stranger to say thank you properly was something that required more courage than she'd expected. He didn't examine it further than that, but it stayed. The mobility service came on Friday as scheduled, which was a small thing but felt larger than it was. Because Victoria had spent 2 days in the manual backup chair, and the backup chair was fine, and she hated it. It was lighter, easier for other people to manage, and it made her feel like a provisional version of herself. Functional, but reduced, like a document saved in the wrong format. The technician's name was Gary. He was 50-ish, efficient, the kind of person who talked to the equipment more than to the patient, which Victoria didn't mind. He replaced the battery pack, checked the secondary cell connection the way Ryan had suggested, and found exactly what Ryan had predicted, a draw issue that had been quietly accelerating the primary drain for weeks, probably longer. This would have killed another battery inside of 6 months, Gary said, not accusatory, just informational. You want me to note it in the service record? Yes, she said, and schedule a full diagnostic for next month. I want everything checked. Gary noted it. Fixed the draw issue while he was there. Left at 11:15. Victoria sat in the repaired chair and ran it forward and back across her living room twice, just to feel it respond the way it was supposed to, and then she went to work. She had a full day. A board call at 1, a vendor meeting at 3, a hiring decision to make on a senior engineering role that had been open for 2 months. She had emails going back 4 days that Miriam had triaged into 3 categories: urgent, needs attention soon, and the pile Miriam privately called the diplomacy queue, which meant messages from people who needed to feel heard without necessarily getting what they wanted. She worked through all of it. That was not unusual. Victoria had always worked through things with a consistency that her board admired and her personal life could not always accommodate, which was a trade she'd made so gradually she hadn't noticed it becoming a trade at all. But she kept thinking about the draw issue, the thing that had been quietly accelerating a problem for weeks, probably longer, the thing that looked fine on the surface and was not fine underneath. She thought, I know what that is. She didn't follow the thought anywhere specific. She had a board call at 1. She called Ryan on Saturday morning. She'd thought about it for 2 days and decided that thinking about it for 2 days was itself a signal that she should stop deliberating and just do the thing. She was decisive in business and less so in the category of things that required her to be a person rather than a professional, which she understood was a disproportion she'd been living with for years. He answered after 3 rings. She could hear something mechanical in the background, bus. Not the shop, different, more domestic. Victoria. Am I calling at a bad time? Lily's trying to convince me we should build a birdhouse, he said, so it's not a bad time so much as a negotiation. She heard distantly a child's voice saying something about specific birds. She couldn't make out the words. Tell her cedar attracts wrens, Victoria said without fully thinking about it, if she wants birds that actually come. A pause. Then Ryan, away from the phone. She says cedar attracts wrens. And Lily's voice, closer now, interested. What's a wren? Small brown bird, Ryan said, back to Victoria. You know birdhouses. My grandmother had a garden. She was obsessive about it. She let that sit for a second because it was a real detail and she'd offered it without planning to. The technician came Friday. You were right about the secondary cell. Drew issue? Drew issue. He said it would have killed another battery in 6 months. Common problem on that model when the chairs worked hard. They don't always catch it on routine maintenance. I'm scheduling a full diagnostic for next month, she paused. I wanted to tell you, since you caught it. I didn't catch it so much as guess it. An informed guess is most of what good diagnostics are, she said. He made a sound that she was starting to recognize, a short exhale through the nose that was somewhere between amusement and acknowledgement. She'd heard it on the phone Wednesday too. It was the sound of someone who didn't perform reactions. How's the transmission? She asked. Done. Picked up yesterday. A beat. You remember I mentioned a transmission? You mentioned it in passing on Wednesday. You paid attention to that. I pay attention to most things, she said. It's a professional habit that carries over. There was a pause that was comfortable in a way she hadn't expected. She was sitting at her kitchen table with coffee going cold beside her, and the Saturday morning light coming through the window at the particular angle that made her apartment look larger than it was. And she was talking to a mechanic she'd met 4 days ago on a dark road, and it was comfortable. I wanted to ask you something, she said, and I want you to say no if the answer is no. I mean that. I'm not asking in a way that makes no difficult. Okay. Hayes Adaptive Solutions does a quarterly review of our field equipment, the mobility devices we produce, and the service infrastructure around them. We work with a small number of outside mechanics and technicians who understand power chairs and adaptive equipment. Not many people in this region have that experience. She stopped. I'm not offering you a job. I want to be clear about that. I'm asking if you'd be interested in a consulting arrangement. Irregular work, your schedule, no obligation beyond what you agree to take on. You'd be evaluating equipment, occasionally doing field repairs, sometimes giving us feedback on design issues we've missed because our engineers don't use the products every day. Ryan didn't answer right away. She waited. How did you know I'd be good at that? He said. You saw me for 40 minutes in the dark. I saw how you worked, she said. You checked the connections twice. You told me it might not work before you tried it. You asked permission before you touched the equipment. Those aren't complicated things, but a lot of people skip them. She picked up her coffee, realized it was cold, put it back down. I've hired people with better credentials who couldn't do what you did on that road. Another pause. What does the pay look like? She told him. He was quiet for a moment that she read as calculation, which was the right response. That's more than I expected, he said. It's what the work is worth. I'd need to know more about what exactly you'd need from me. That's reasonable. I can send information, or we could meet. Whatever works better for you. She kept her voice level, professional, and then decided that professional was the wrong register for this particular conversation and said, "I'm not trying to repay you. I want to be clear about that too. I'm not doing this because I feel I owe you something." "I know," he said, and she believed him. "Why are you doing it then?" She thought about it honestly. "Because I run a company that makes equipment for people like me, and I found out 4 days ago that a mechanic on a county road understands that equipment better than some of my service contractors. That's a problem I should fix regardless of who pointed it out." Ryan let out a slow breath. "Okay. Okay, you want information, or okay, you're interested?" "Both," he said. "Send me what you've got." She wrote down his email, which was a Gmail address with his full name in it. Straightforward, no numbers. "I'll send it Monday," she said. "Take your time with it." "Lily wants to know if you like birds," he said. Victoria blinked. "What?" "She's been standing next to me for the last 2 minutes. She wants to know." Victoria looked at the window, the morning light, the cold coffee. "Tell her I like birds fine," she said, "especially wrens." She heard Lily's voice say something that sounded like satisfied, and then the background sound of small feet on a floor. "She approves," Ryan said. "I'm relieved." He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, and it was an uncomplicated sound. Not performed, not careful, just a person finding something genuinely funny. She noticed it in the way you notice things you hadn't expected. "Monday," he said. "I'll look for the email." "Monday," she agreed. About. She sent the email Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, Miriam had knocked on her office door with an expression that meant something had happened that was outside normal parameters. "What?" Victoria said. Miriam held up her tablet. On it was a post from a community page, one of those local Facebook groups for the Millhaven area, the kind Victoria had never joined and rarely thought about. Someone had shared a short post. Saw something on County Road 17 Tuesday night. A woman in a wheelchair stranded in the dark. Dozens of cars drove past. One guy in a pickup stopped and fixed her chair with stuff from his truck. Don't know who he was, but this city needs more people like that. The post had 847 shares. Victoria looked at it for a moment. "When did this go up?" "Thursday," Miriam said. "But it's been picking up since yesterday. Someone tagged the local news station." "How many people saw this?" "The post itself, about 12,000. But the Millhaven Courier shared it this morning and it's been republishing since." Victoria set down her pen. She thought about a Tuesday night in October and the specific private quality of that hour on the road, and how it had not felt like something that should be 12,000 people's business. "Do they have names?" she asked. "Not yet. The original poster didn't identify anyone, but people are trying to figure out who it was." Miriam paused. "There are comments asking if the woman was you. Your name comes up a couple of times." Victoria absorbed this without expression, which was a thing she was skilled at. "What are they saying?" "Mostly positive. They like the story." Miriam set the tablet down on the desk. "There are also some comments about the cars that didn't stop. Those are less charitable." Victoria looked at the window. 14 floors up, the city moved at its usual pace, indifferent and continuous. "I didn't post this," she said. "I know. I assumed you didn't." Miriam picked up the tablet. "Do you want to respond to anything, or stay quiet?" Victoria thought about Ryan, about the fact that he'd had a long day, had grease on his arms, had a daughter waiting at home, and had said not one word about any of it being an inconvenience. She thought about how quickly a story could become a thing that belonged to other people. "Stay quiet for now," she said, "but get me the contact for whoever runs the Courier's digital desk." What happened over the following week was not something Victoria had planned and was not something she fully controlled, which was an unfamiliar experience. The Courier ran a piece on Wednesday. Short, factual, no names. They hadn't been able to confirm identities. Local woman stranded on rural road. Anonymous Good Samaritan intervenes. The piece was maybe 400 words and 3 paragraphs, and it would have stayed small except that a regional news aggregator picked it up on Thursday and a larger outlet republished it Friday, and by the following Monday, it had traveled from Ohio to national feeds, via the particular random logic by which the internet decided what it cared about that week. Victoria received 14 interview requests by the following Wednesday. She declined all of them. Ryan called on Thursday. "Have you seen this?" he said when she answered. He sounded more baffled than upset, which she noted. "Yes, I didn't put the original post up." "I know," Doris told me. "Apparently half her neighborhood has been talking about it." A pause. "Someone from the Courier called my shop this morning. Derek answered and told them I was busy, which I was, but then he came and found me with this look on his face like he thought I was in trouble. What did Derek think you'd done?" That's a longer conversation. She could hear the shop sounds in the background, like the radio, the distant impact of something metal. "I didn't call them back." "You don't have to," she said. "I know I don't have to." He paused. "The thing is, Lily found out." Victoria waited. Her teacher mentioned it. There was a story going around the school, just the vague version, no names, about a man who stopped to help someone on County Road 17. And Lily came home and told me about it like it was news, and I had to tell her it was us. How did she take it? "She asked me why it was a big deal," Ryan said. "She said, 'Dad, you just fixed someone's wheelchair. Why are people acting like that's amazing?'" A pause. I didn't have a good answer for that. Victoria looked at the window. Outside, November had settled in gray and definite, the kind of weather that felt permanent even though it wasn't. "The true answer is probably that it happens less than it should," she said. "So when it does happen, it stands out." That's a depressing true answer. "Yes." "Lily thinks the depressing answer is wrong," he said. "She thinks most people would stop. She thinks the ones who didn't were just in a hurry." That's a more charitable interpretation than most adults would arrive at. "She's 7. She hasn't had time to get cynical yet." He said it without bitterness, more like he was noting something he wanted to protect. "I'm not planning to talk to any reporters. I just wanted to check what your position was." "Same as yours. I don't want to be a story." "We're kind of already a story." "We're a story that other people are telling," she said. "That's different from being one." He was quiet for a moment, thinking something through. What are you going to do about it? She'd been working on the answer to that question for 3 days, in the margins of meetings and in the long early mornings when she did her best thinking. "There's a program I've been wanting to fund for 2 years, she said. Emergency mobility equipment for people who can't afford replacement batteries and repairs. The budget for it keeps getting deprioritized because there's always something more urgent. She paused. This seems like a reasonable moment to make it less optional. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice had shifted slightly, quieter. You do that because of what happened on the road? I do it because it needs to be done, she said. What happened on the road made me think about why I'd been waiting. She stopped. There were probably people on that road every week who didn't have a Ryan Walker pulling over, who sat there longer than 47 minutes. I make equipment for people like that. I should be making sure they can afford to use it. The line was quiet for a few seconds. You know, Ryan said slowly, you're a harder person to figure out than I expected. What did you expect? Honestly, I didn't expect anything. I pulled over because there was a woman alone on a road in the dark. I didn't expect to still be talking to her a week later. Victoria looked at her desk, the neat stacks of papers, the cold coffee she kept making and forgetting to drink. A habit, apparently. Neither did I, she said. For whatever that's worth. It's worth something, he said simply. She was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she needed to let a thing sit without examining it to pieces. Did you read the consulting materials I sent? Yeah, twice. And? I have questions, mostly about the service contractor overlap. I don't want to be stepping on arrangements you already have. That's a legitimate concern. Can you come in next week? I'd rather talk through it in person than by email. A pause. Millhaven? My office, yes. Whenever works for your schedule. Wednesday afternoon, he said. I can move some things around. Wednesday at 2, she said. I'll send the address. I know where your building is, he said. It's on Meridian, the one with the accessible entrance on the north side. She hadn't told him which building. He'd looked it up. She noticed that, and the fact that he'd noted the accessible entrance specifically, and she tucked both observations away without comment. 2 o'clock, she said. 2 o'clock, he confirmed. After she hung up, she sat for a moment in the particular quiet of her office in the middle of a workday, with the city outside the window going about its indifferent business, and she thought about a drawing she had not seen but that she somehow knew about. A man with a wrench, a person in a wheelchair, careful stars around the edges. She thought about Lily's question, why are people acting like that's amazing? And she thought, because we've accepted a version of normal where it isn't. She picked up her pen and wrote on the legal pad she kept for things she didn't want to forget. Emergency Equipment Fund, not optional. Q1, underlined it once, set the pen down. Outside, November kept going, gray and definite, and somewhere underneath it, starting to shift. But Wednesday came with rain. Not dramatic rain, just the steady, indifferent kind that Central Ohio did through November. Fine enough to soak through a jacket if you stood in it long enough. Relentless enough to make the drive into downtown slow and irritable. Ryan arrived at 7 minutes past 2, which he would have been annoyed about if the parking situation on Meridian hadn't been as bad as it was. He came through the north entrance, which had an automatic door and a ramp, rather than the stone steps that ran up the front of the building. He was wearing the cleanest version of his usual clothes, dark jeans, a button-down under a jacket, boots that he'd actually cleaned the night before, which Lily had noticed and commented on with raised eyebrows. Why are your boots clean? I have a meeting. With the wheelchair lady? Her name is Victoria. Is it a date? It's a business meeting, Lily. Your boots are very clean for a business meeting. He hadn't had a good answer for that either. The Hayes Adaptive Solutions office was on the 9th floor. The elevator was fast, and the lobby had that specific quality of spaces where people came to be taken seriously. The receptionist pointed him toward a waiting area, and he sat for 4 minutes looking at the framed diagrams on the walls. Technical drawings of mobility equipment, detailed and precise, the kind of drawings that came from people who understood what they were building and why. He was looking at one of them closely, a cross-section of a power chair frame with load-bearing annotations, when he heard the motor of a wheelchair behind him and turned. Victoria had clearly just come from a meeting. She was in the full professional version of herself. The fitted blazer, the pulled-back hair, the surface of someone who managed rooms for a living. But she looked at him the same way she had on the road, directly, without the social preamble most people used to warm up to actual conversation. You're looking at the frame spec, she said. The load distribution is wrong, he said. For a user over 200 pounds, this stress point here, he gestured at the drawing, is going to fail before the estimated cycle count. Victoria looked at the drawing, then at him. That model had a recall 2 years ago. For that exact issue? For that exact issue. He nodded. So your engineers knew. Eventually, she held his gaze for a moment. Come on back. He followed her down the hallway to a conference room that was smaller and less formal than the lobby suggested. A round table, natural light, no one else in it. She'd already put a folder at one of the chairs. He sat across from her, and she opened her own copy of the consulting materials, and they started talking. It was by any external measure a business meeting. They talked through the scope of work, the service contractor question he'd raised, the timeline for the first equipment review. She was precise and prepared, which he'd expected, but she also listened in a way that people in her position didn't always manage, not waiting for him to finish so she could respond, but actually taking in what he said and letting it affect what came next. At one point he said, your field technicians aren't asking users the right diagnostic questions. They're asking about the equipment. They should be asking about the routines, how the person uses the chair, what their day looks like, what stress the equipment is actually under. He stopped, aware that he was telling a CEO how her company should operate. Sorry, don't apologize for that, she said. That's exactly the kind of thing I'm paying for. He looked at her. I have engineers, she said. I have service contractors. I don't have someone who fixed a stranger's chair on a rural road in the dark because he understood both the equipment and the situation. She set her pen down. That's a different kind of knowledge. I want it in the room. Ryan sat with that for a second. Outside the conference room window, the rain was still coming down, steady and gray, streaking the glass in long, slow lines. Wednesday afternoons work, he said, and I can do field calls on Saturdays if the timing's right. That's enough to start, she said. They finished the meeting in just under an hour. He signed the consulting agreement at the table. She'd had it ready, which he appreciated because it meant she'd expected him to say yes, not out of arrogance, but out of preparation, and he understood the difference. At the door, she said, "Thank you for coming in. You said it'd be worth my time." Was it? He thought about the frame spec drawing in the lobby, the load distribution, the recall he'd spotted in 30 seconds that had taken her engineers longer. "Yeah," he said. "It was." She nodded. There was something in her face that was not quite the professional version and not quite something else, something in between, where the two versions of her overlapped imperfectly. "Same time next week," she said. "I'll be here," he said. He went back through the north entrance into the rain and stood for a second on the sidewalk before walking to his truck. The city moved around him, umbrellas and headlights, and the particular afternoon sounds of a Wednesday in November. He thought about a drawing on a refrigerator, stars around the edges, for the things that mattered. He got in the truck and drove home. The story broke wide on a Thursday in late November, which was nobody's plan. What happened was this. A journalist named Carla Reyes, who wrote a column for a mid-sized regional magazine called Ohio Current, had been following the original Courier piece since October. She wasn't working on it aggressively. It was more of a background interest, the kind of story she returned to when other assignments were slow. She'd been trying for 3 weeks to identify the two people involved, not with any malicious intent, just with the particular persistence of someone who believed a good story deserved to be told completely. She found Ryan first. It wasn't difficult. The Coldwell and Pierce facility had a limited number of contractors on record, and a power chair repaired roadside with automotive tools pointed to someone with a specific skill set, and Millhaven was not a large city. She called the shop on a Thursday morning, got Derek, who had no filter and no reason to suspect the call was anything other than routine, said yes. Ryan Walker was the guy. He works here. You want his number? Ryan called Victoria 20 minutes after Carla Reyes called him. "A journalist found me," he said. There was no preamble, which she appreciated. "Carla Reyes from Ohio Current," Victoria said. A brief pause. "She called you too?" "Her editor called my office this morning. I haven't called back." She was standing at her office window, phone against her ear, watching the street below where the Thursday morning traffic was moving in its ordinary way. "What did she say to you?" "That she wanted to tell the story properly, that she wasn't interested in making either of us look bad, that this was about something larger than one night on a road." He paused. She sounded like she meant it. They always sound like they mean it. "You've dealt with press before." "I've dealt with press before," she confirmed. Some of them did mean it. Some of them meant something different from what they said. She moved away from the window and sat down. "The question is what you want." "I don't want to be famous," he said immediately. "I have a shop to run and a kid to raise. I don't need my face on a magazine." Then we decline. "But here's the thing." He stopped for a second, and she could hear him choosing words. "The program you're funding, the emergency equipment thing. You told me you'd been wanting to do it for 2 years and kept deprioritizing it, and now you're doing it because of what happened." "Yes." "If people know about that program, more people might use it, and if they know why it exists," he trailed off. "I'm not saying I want the attention. I'm saying maybe the story is useful even if the attention isn't." Victoria was quiet for a moment. She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it since the Courier piece ran, in the way she thought about most things, systematically, from multiple angles, with a specific focus on what the actual outcome was versus what the intended outcome was. "If we talk to Reyes," she said, "we're not in control of the framing. We can give her accurate information. We can tell her what we want emphasized, but she writes the piece and her editor approves it, and the headline is whatever the headline is." "I know." "And once it's out, it's out. The version of events that people remember won't necessarily be the accurate one. It'll be the one that was easiest to share." "I know that too." He paused. "But the program is real. The equipment fund is real. That doesn't change based on how someone frames a story about us." She looked at the legal pad on her desk, where Emergency Equipment Fund, not optional. Q1 was still underlined in her handwriting from 3 weeks ago. No, she said. It doesn't. So? She picked up the pen and turned it in her fingers, a habit she had when she was deciding something. I'll call Reyes back, she said, but we do it together. One conversation, both of us, so the story doesn't get divided into two separate versions. You want me to come to your office? Or we call her together, your preference. He thought about it. Call. I can do it Friday morning if you can. Friday at 9, she said. Carla Reyes was, as Ryan had assessed, someone who appeared to mean what she said. She was thorough without being aggressive. She asked questions that suggested she'd done actual research, and she didn't try to inject drama into things that weren't dramatic. She asked about the road, the repair, the phone call on Wednesday. She asked about the consulting arrangement. She asked Victoria about the equipment fund. She also asked, near the end of the call, a question neither of them had expected. I've talked to people who know both of you, she said, separately, and the thing that keeps coming up is that you're both people who are used to handling things alone. Is that a fair characterization? There was a short silence on the line. Probably, Ryan said. For different reasons, Victoria added. What are the different reasons? Reyes asked. Another silence, this one longer. Ryan let Victoria take it, which she did, carefully. I built a company in a field where people looked at me and made a decision before I spoke, she said. You learn to need less from other people when needing things can be used against you. And you? Reyes asked Ryan. Single dad, he said. Small business. There's nobody else to pick up the slack if you stop. He paused. That's not a complaint, it's just the situation. And then you ended up on a road together, Reyes said. Yeah, Ryan said. I guess we did. The piece ran 2 weeks later. Victoria read it on a Tuesday morning with coffee that was, for once, still warm. It was 3,000 words, carefully written, and Reyes had done what she'd said she would, kept the focus on the program, on the broader question of who the infrastructure of daily life was built for, on what it cost people to ask for help, and what it cost communities when the answer wasn't there. The headline was, The Night No One Stopped, and the One Person Who Did. Ryan texted her at 8:15, have you seen it? She texted back, reading it now. Is it okay? She thought about the question. It was honest reporting. It was accurate. It made her feel exposed in the specific way that accurate things sometimes did when you had been careful for a long time about what you let be seen. It's okay, she wrote. She got it right. His reply took a minute. Lily wants to know if there's a photo of you. She's convinced you look like someone from a movie she likes. What movie? She won't tell me. I think she's embarrassed. Victoria set her phone down and looked at the article on her screen. There was a photo, a professional headshot she'd had taken for the company website, 3 years old, the version of herself she presented to the world. Composed. Unreadable. The professional version. She looked at it for a moment and thought about what she'd said to Carla Reyes. You learn to need less from other people when needing things can be used against you. She had said it matter-of-factly, the way she stated most things, and it had not felt like a confession at the time. Reading it back, she wasn't sure. She picked up her phone again. Tell Lily I'll try to live up to the comparison, she wrote. She says you already do. Her words, not mine. She's 7. 7.5, he corrected. She's very specific about the half. The piece moved fast. By Wednesday, it had been picked up by 2 national outlets. By Thursday, there were emails from accessibility advocacy organizations, from disability rights groups, from a documentary production company in New York, whose interest Victoria declined politely. There were emails from people who had been stranded, people who used power chairs and manual chairs and walkers and crutches, and who wrote, some of them at length, about what it was like to need something from the physical world, and find the physical world hadn't been designed with you in mind. Victoria read all of them. She didn't delegate that to Miriam. She sat at her desk in the evenings after the formal workday ended and read them one by one, and some of them were straightforward, and some of them were angry, and some of them were the careful, composed kind of writing that happened when people wanted to be taken seriously and had been told implicitly, many times, that they probably wouldn't be. She recognized that writing. She wrote back to as many as she could, not form responses, actual replies specific to what each person had said. It took her most of 3 evenings, and Miriam noticed the light under her office door and said nothing, which was the right call. The equipment fund was officially announced at the end of that week. Hayes Adaptive Solutions would provide emergency battery replacements, repair services, and loaner equipment at no cost to qualifying users in a 6-county region, with a plan to expand statewide within 18 months. The fund had been in development since early November, the announcement noted, and had been accelerated by recent events. The response was, by any measure, significant. Ryan called on Saturday. He'd been following the coverage, not obsessively, but he'd set a Google alert which Lily had discovered and teased him about. And he sounded like someone who was processing the scale of something he'd had a small part in starting. People keep calling the shop, he said. Not for repairs, just to, I don't know, talk. One guy drove 40 minutes to shake my hand. I didn't know what to do with that. What did you do? Shook his hand, he said, and then asked if his car needed anything while he was there. He got an oil change. Victoria laughed. It surprised her, the way laughing sometimes did when it was genuine. That's a reasonable response. I don't know how to be a symbol, he said. I'm not built for it. You're not a symbol, she said. You're a person who did a specific thing on a specific night. The symbol is a story other people built around that thing. Is that better or worse? She thought about it honestly. Depends on the day. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear the particular quiet of his house on a Saturday, different from the shop, slower, the kind of quiet that had a person in it rather than equipment. Derek wants to hire another mechanic, he said. We've been getting more work since the article. Not because of the article exactly, more like people who'd been putting off coming in. They came in. Are you going to hire someone? Probably have to, if it holds. He paused. It might not hold. It might, she said. You sound sure. I'm not sure, she said, but the work you do is good, and people have a way of eventually finding good work if it's in front of them long enough. Is that a business philosophy? It's an observation. She paused. It applies to mechanics and to other things. He let that sit without pushing it, which was a thing she'd noticed about him. He didn't pull on threads he wasn't invited to pull on. He waited until people offered. It was an unusual quality. How are you? He asked. Not the social version of the question, the real one. She looked around her apartment. Saturday afternoon, the winter light coming in flat and pale. The city quiet in the particular way of weekends. She had a full inbox and a board meeting on Monday and a decision to make about a new product line that had been argued over for 6 months. Tired, she said. But okay. The kind of tired that means things are moving, not the kind that means they're stopping. There's a difference? There's a big difference. He considered that. Yeah, he said. I know what you mean. But the Wednesday meetings had become a fixed point. Ryan came in at 2. They went through the equipment review work. He asked questions she found useful and made observations her engineers occasionally pushed back on and were occasionally forced to concede. He had a way of looking at a technical problem from the user's side first, not from the design spec or the cost sheet, but from the question of what it was actually like to depend on this thing every day. Her team had started looking forward to his input in the way that people looked forward to something that made their work harder in the right direction. He was still a mechanic who ran a small shop on Carmichael Street. He was not trying to be anything else. He signed his consulting notes with his full name and the shop's address, and when Victoria had suggested he might want to consider a more formal consulting identity, an LLC, a business card, something separate from the garage, he'd thought about it for a week and said he'd rather keep it simple. The shop is what I am, he'd said. I don't need to make a different version of it for different rooms. She'd thought about that for longer than she should have. I don't need to make a different version of it for different rooms. She had been making different versions of herself for different rooms for so long it was closer to her natural state than whatever was underneath. She didn't say that out loud, but she thought about it. The Wednesday in early December when things shifted was not a dramatic Wednesday. It was ordinary in almost every way. The rain again, the round table in the small conference room, the technical folder open between them, a question about a new joystick mechanism that one of her engineers had flagged for field testing. They'd been working for about an hour when Ryan looked up from the spec sheet and said, without particular lead-up, "Lily asks about you." Victoria looked up. "What does she ask?" "Whether you're okay. Whether you found out what was wrong with your battery. Whether you still think wrens are the best birds." He said it with a small, contained smile. "I'm just reporting the questions." "What do you tell her?" "That you're fine, that the battery got fixed, and that I don't know your current position on birds." He set the spec sheet down. "She wants to meet you. She's been asking for a month, and I've been finding reasons to postpone it because I wasn't sure if that was—" He stopped. "Appropriate is the wrong word. I just wasn't sure." Victoria looked at him. He was being careful, which was different from how he was about mechanical things, where he was precise and direct. With this, he was careful, the way people were careful about things that mattered to them and that they weren't sure would be received the way they hoped. "I'd like to meet her," Victoria said. Not quickly, not to fill a silence, just honestly. "Yeah?" "She drew a picture of me before she'd ever seen me," she said. "She asked if I liked birds. She told you that being scared and not being able to show it was bad." She paused. "She sounds like someone worth knowing." Ryan looked at her for a moment in the way he sometimes did, not reading her exactly, more like confirming something he'd already believed. "She's got opinions about everything," he said. "Fair warning." "I have opinions about everything," Victoria said. "We'll get along fine." He nodded, and the small smile from before came back, and she noticed that she liked it, which she had been noticing for several weeks and had been choosing not to examine. She examined it now, briefly, and decided that what she felt was uncomplicated enough to be honest and complicated enough not to rush. She looked back at the spec sheet. "The joystick issue," she said. "I want to hear what you think about the mounting angle before we send it to field test." He pulled the sheet closer. "Okay, so the problem is here." And they went back to work, the rain coming down outside the conference room window, the city going about its December business, the particular hum of a building where people were doing things that mattered, and two people at a round table who had arrived here from a dark road and a dead battery, and 47 minutes of counting headlights, working carefully on the question of how to make something broken work better. It was not a dramatic afternoon. It was not the kind of afternoon that made the news or ended up in a magazine column or generated 12,000 shares on a community page. But Victoria Hayes, who had learned a long time ago to measure the value of a thing by how much it cost to build, understood that the undramatic afternoons were sometimes the ones that held the most weight. She turned the page of the spec sheet. Outside, December kept going, gray and cold and full of small, ordinary things that didn't look like much from the outside and were, from the inside, almost everything. Lily met Victoria on a Saturday in mid-December, 12 days before Christmas, at a coffee shop on Hargrove Street that had the specific quality of a place that had been there long enough to stop trying to impress anyone. Worn wooden tables, mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu and handwriting that changed depending on who opened that morning. Ryan had suggested it because it was accessible, wide door, no step at the entrance, enough space between the tables, and Victoria noticed that he'd thought about this without being asked, and without mentioning that he'd thought about it, which said something about the kind of attention he paid to the world. Lily arrived in a winter coat that was slightly too big for her, and a wool hat with a pom-pom that she had, according to Ryan, refused to take off since October. She walked in ahead of her father with the confidence of someone who had been told this was an important meeting and had decided to meet that importance head-on. She spotted Victoria at the corner table and stopped walking. She stared for a solid 4 seconds. Then she turned to Ryan and said in a stage whisper, "She does look like her." "We've talked about this," Ryan said quietly. "I'm just saying, Lily." Lily approached the table with recovered composure and extended her hand in the formal manner of a child who had been taught how to introduce herself and who took that instruction seriously. "Hi, I'm Lily Walker. My dad fixed your wheelchair." "I know," Victoria said, shaking her hand. "I'm Victoria. I've been wanting to meet you." Lily sat down across from her, still wearing the hat, and studied her with an openness that adults had mostly been trained to conceal. "Dad said you run a company." "I do." "What kind of company?" "We make equipment for people who need help moving around, wheelchairs mostly, and software to go with them." Lily considered this. Did you make your wheelchair? Not personally, but my company helped design the new version of it. So you made something that helps you and other people at the same time. That's one way to think about it. Lily nodded, apparently satisfied with this, and picked up the laminated menu and studied it with the same seriousness she'd applied to everything else. Ryan sat down beside her and met Victoria's eyes across the table with an expression that said, "I told you she had opinions." Victoria kept her face neutral, but felt the corner of her mouth do something she didn't fully suppress. They stayed for 2 hours. Lily had hot chocolate and a cookie she declared merely adequate, which made the barista visibly offended. She asked Victoria about the wheelchair, not in the careful tiptoeing way adults usually asked, but directly, with genuine curiosity. How fast did it go? Could it go upstairs? What happened when the battery died? Victoria answered all of it plainly, and Lily listened with the focus she apparently brought to information she considered worth keeping. At one point, Lily said, "Were you scared when it died on the road?" Victoria looked at her, 7.5 years old, pom-pom hat, half a cookie in her hand, asking the question with the directness of someone who had already decided that the honest answer was the only useful one. "Yes," Victoria said, "I was." Lily nodded, slow. "Dad says it's okay to be scared as long as you keep thinking." "Your dad is right." "I know." She said it without arrogance, just as fact. She glanced at Ryan, who was looking at his coffee. "He's right about most things. Don't tell him I said that. He'll get smug." Ryan did not appear smug. He appeared to be a person trying very hard not to smile. Victoria looked at him over the rim of her cup, and something moved through her that was warm and uncomplicated and that she didn't try to categorize because some things were better understood by living them than by labeling them. After Lily had exhausted her questions and moved on to drawing something in a small notebook she'd produced from her coat pocket, Ryan and Victoria talked. Not about the company, not about equipment reviews or service contractors or load-bearing specs, about things that mattered in the way that personal things mattered. The way he'd landed in Mill Haven when he'd meant to be somewhere else and had stopped meaning to leave. The way she'd built the company in the 4 years after the accident, partly because building something was the only way she'd found to stop thinking about what the accident had taken. She didn't say that last part lightly. She said it the way she'd been saying more things lately, carefully, but without the full armor of the professional version. He listened the way he always listened, without hurrying it, without offering the reflexive reassurances that people usually deployed when someone said something honest and uncomfortable. He said, "You stopped thinking about it?" "No," she said. "I stopped letting it be the loudest thing in the room." He thought about that. "That's harder than stopping." "Yes," she said. "It is." Outside the coffee shop window, December was cold and pale, the streets half empty in the particular way of a Saturday morning when people were still inside with their own warmth and their own ordinary lives. A few people walked past with their hands in their pockets, heads down against the wind, the world continuing its regular business. Lily looked up from her notebook and said without context, "I finished it." She turned the notebook around. She had drawn the coffee shop, recognizable in the loose, emphatic way of a 7-year-old who drew to capture feeling rather than accuracy. 3 figures at a table. The middle one had a pom-pom hat. The one on the right had what appeared to be a wheelchair. Around all 3 of them, careful and deliberate, were the stars. Victoria looked at the drawing for a moment. "Can I keep this one?" she asked. Lily considered the request with the gravity it deserved. Then she tore the page out and slid it across the table. "You can have it," she said, "but I want you to put it somewhere you can see it, not just in a drawer." "Not in a drawer," Victoria agreed. Lily nodded once. Terms accepted. But the Millhaven Community Recognition Ceremony happened in late January, which gave it the quality of a destination everyone had been heading toward without necessarily choosing to head there. The city did these events twice a year, recognizing residents for contributions to community life. And the mayor's office had reached out to both Victoria and Ryan in December. Victoria had almost declined. She had run through all the reasons it was unnecessary, that the program spoke for itself, that she was uncomfortable with the specific performance of being honored in public for things she'd done because they needed doing. Ryan had called her during the deliberation. "You're thinking too hard about it," he said. "Probably. It's It's not about you being honored, it's about the program getting seen. More people see it, more people use it. More people use it, more people get help. He paused. You said that, about good work being in front of people long enough. She had said that. You're using my own logic against me. Is the logic wrong? It wasn't. She called the mayor's office the next morning. The ceremony was held in the main hall of the Millhaven Civic Center, a building that had been built in the 70s and renovated twice since without quite resolving the architectural awkwardness of its original design. The accessible entrance was on the east side, clearly signed, which Victoria noted with approval. The hall held perhaps 200 people, most of them in the middle section of folding chairs. A raised platform at the front where the podium stood under fluorescent lights that had been partially softened by the addition of several floor lamps that gave the whole room a slightly domestic quality. Lily was there, in the front row, in a dress she had clearly agreed to wear under protest. Ryan had told Victoria this in a text that morning. She wanted to wear the hat. We compromised. The hat is in her bag. She was sitting between Ryan and Doris Hartwell, who had apparently decided that attending counted as enough of an event to warrant her good coat. Victoria arrived with Miriam, who had insisted on coming and who had been quietly managing the logistics of the Equipment Fund's launch for 2 months with the competent, unhurried efficiency that made her indispensable in ways that weren't always visible until you tried to imagine the alternative. There were 4 other honorees: a retired teacher who had run an after-school tutoring program for 22 years, a firefighter who had stayed with a family for 6 hours after a house fire until their relatives arrived from out of state, a woman who had quietly been delivering meals to elderly neighbors every Sunday for 11 years without telling anyone until her neighbor mentioned it to a friend who mentioned it to someone on the city council, a teenager who had organized a winter coat drive and collected 1,400 coats. Victoria looked at the list in the program and thought, this is what a community actually is. Not institutions or infrastructure, though those mattered, but people doing specific things for other specific people in the gaps that the larger systems couldn't reach. Doing them not because there was a camera or a ceremony or a piece in a magazine, but because the thing needed doing, and they were there. She thought about a Tuesday night in October, about headlights appearing and disappearing in the fog. When Ryan's name was called, he walked to the podium in the dark jeans and button-down he'd worn to their first Wednesday meeting. The cleanest version of himself, without pretending to be a different version. He stood at the microphone for a second and looked at the room with the expression of someone who found crowds mildly baffling and was deciding how honest to be about that. He said, I've been trying to figure out what to say for about 3 weeks. I wrote something, then I threw it out. Then I wrote it again. He looked down at the podium, then back up. What I kept getting stuck on was the word heroic. People have been using it. About pulling over on a road. About spending 40 minutes with a jump pack. He shook his head. I'm a mechanic. I had the tools. I had the time. I was the only person who stopped. That's not heroic. That should be ordinary. The room was quiet. I think about the cars that didn't stop, he said. Not to judge them. I've driven past people before. Everybody has. You make a calculation in the moment. Time, safety. Am I the right person for this? I get it. He paused. But I keep thinking, what's the cost of recalculating? What does it actually take to slow down? Not to solve everything, just to slow down and see. He looked at Lily in the front row. She was watching him with the serious, complete attention she reserved for things that she'd decided were important. My daughter told me that being scared and not being able to show it was bad, he said. She was 7 when she said it. She said it about a stranger she'd never met, based on 30 seconds of context. He paused. Kids are better at this than we are. They haven't learned yet that other people's hard moments are inconvenient. He looked back at the room. The woman I stopped for, Victoria Hayes, built a program in the last few months that gives emergency equipment to people who can't afford it when their mobility devices break down. She'd been wanting to build it for 2 years. What happened on that road made her stop waiting. He paused. I didn't do that. She did that. I just slowed down long enough for someone capable of doing something important to get back on the road. He stepped back from the microphone and the room came back to itself in the particular way rooms did after a silence. Not applause yet, just breath, just the sound of people recalibrating. Then it was applause. Real applause. The kind that built from a few people and then pulled everyone in, not because they'd been cued to, but because something had gotten through. Victoria sat in the second row and listened to it and felt something she hadn't expected to feel in a civic center on a Tuesday night in January. Something close to undone. Not in a bad way, in the way of a thing that had been held together for a long time by the pressure of holding it together, and was now being allowed to simply be what it was. She had been alone for a long time. She had built a language for that aloneness. Competence, preparation, forward motion. She had made it into something functional and even admirable, and she had stopped noticing how much it cost to maintain. She noticed now. When her name was called, she moved to the podium and adjusted the microphone down and looked at the room. 200 faces, the retired teacher, the firefighter, the woman who delivered meals on Sundays, the teenager with 1,400 coats, Ryan in the front row, next to Lily, who had put the hat back on at some point during the ceremony. Victoria said, "I'm going to tell you something that isn't flattering." The room settled. "I ignored a warning light on my wheelchair for 2 weeks," she said. "My technician called. My assistant mentioned it. I kept telling myself I'd deal with it after the next meeting. And then I found myself on County Road 17 at night in a dead chair, watching cars go by, and I thought, this is what it costs. Not the flat tire version of it, the actual version." She looked at the program in her hand, the 4 other names on the list. "I've built a company that makes equipment for people who depend on it every day. And I had spent 2 weeks ignoring a warning light on my own equipment because I was busy, because I was used to pushing through." She paused. "The equipment fund exists because of what happened that night, but it should have existed before that night. The need was always there. I just hadn't been willing to stop and see it." She looked up. "Ryan said I should stop waiting. He didn't use those words. He used jump cables and a flashlight in a field. But that's what it was." She paused. "I think about what would have happened if he hadn't stopped. Not to me. I would have been found eventually. Marcus was already driving those roads. But to the larger thing, the program, the waiting." She shook her head. "Sometimes the most important thing someone can do for you is simply not keep going." She stepped back. The applause came again, and she let it happen around her, and went back to her seat. And when she sat down, Lily leaned across Ryan from the front row and whispered loudly, "That was really good." "Thank you," Victoria whispered back. "You can be honest in public," Lily said approvingly. "That's hard for adults." Ryan pressed his hand briefly over his eyes. Afterward, in the lobby, with the ceremony over and people collecting coats and talking in the dispersed, winding-down way of crowds, Doris Hartwell found Victoria near the accessible exit and introduced herself with the directness of a woman who had decided at some point in her life that preamble was for people with more time than she had. "I watched that boy work himself half to death," she said. "Has for 4 years, since that wife of his—" She paused, revised. "Since Lily's mother left. He doesn't ask for things, doesn't accept help without arguing about it for a week first." She looked at Victoria with the assessing attention of a retired teacher who had spent decades reading people. "He smiles more now, lately, compared to before." Victoria looked at her. "I'm not telling you what to do with that information," Doris said. "I'm just making an observation. I'm old enough to make observations without explaining them." She patted Victoria's arm once, briefly, and walked away to find her coat. Victoria stood near the exit for a moment, processing. Around her, the lobby went on being a lobby. Ryan found her a few minutes later. Lily was with Doris, apparently lobbying for some kind of post-ceremony food stop. "You were good up there," he said. "You were better." "I had less to say." "You had exactly the right amount to say." She looked at him. "The part about slowing down, I've been thinking about that." "Yeah?" "Not just about the road." She paused. "In general." He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was hearing what she actually meant rather than what she'd technically said. "Me too," he said simply. They stood in the lobby of the Millhaven Civic Center, 2 people in a crowd that was thinning, December still pressing cold against the tall windows, the fluorescent lights overhead still slightly softened by the floor lamps that someone had brought in to make a bureaucratic space feel temporarily human. "Lily wants to go to the diner on 5th, Ryan said. "She's been making her case to Doris for 6 minutes. Doris is going to agree in about 2 more minutes because she always does." "Do you want company?" Victoria asked. She said it plainly, without the professional frame, without the careful construction she usually applied to things that required any kind of vulnerability. Just the question. He looked at her the way he had on the road, directly, without weighing whether it was his business. "Yeah," he said. "We want company." She pulled her coat on. He held it at the shoulder without making it a production, the way someone did who had thought about it in advance and then decided not to overthink the act itself. They went to find Lily, who had successfully convinced Doris and was standing by the door with her hat on and her coat open despite the cold, waiting with the impatience of a person who had places to be. "Finally," she said. "Ikam." The diner on Fifth was warm and loud and smelled like coffee and something fried, and they took a booth in the back because it was easier for the wheelchair, and Lily ordered pancakes at 8:15 at night without a trace of irony, and Doris ordered decaf and said she wasn't hungry and then ate half of Ryan's fries. It was not a remarkable evening by any external measure. No one would write about it. It would not be in a magazine or on a community page or shared 12,000 times. It was 4 people in a diner in January, in a city that went about its business outside the steamed-up windows, eating and talking about small things, Lily's science project, the new mechanic Ryan had hired at the shop, a water stain on the ceiling of the diner that Lily had decided looked exactly like a running horse, which the others could not fully agree on but could not fully deny. Ordinary things. The kind that didn't look like much from the outside. Victoria sat in her chair at the end of the booth and looked at Lily, arguing about the ceiling stain with the focused conviction of someone who was entirely certain of what she saw. And at Ryan watching his daughter with the quiet, unperformed love that parents sometimes had when they thought no one was looking, and at Doris eating fries she'd said she didn't want. And she thought, this is the actual version, not the professional version, not the composed headshot on the company website, not the woman on the stage in the Civic Center who was good at speaking in public and had learned over many years to make competence into a kind of armor. This, a diner booth, pancakes at 8:15, a drawing in her coat pocket with stars around the edges. She thought about County Road 17, about the amber warning light she'd ignored, about the strange, specific mercy of breakdowns, the way they stripped away the version of yourself you'd been maintaining and left you with whatever was actually underneath. She thought about what had been underneath. A person who needed things and had spent years making that need very small and very quiet. A person who had built a company partly because building was a way of staying in motion. And motion was a way of not sitting still long enough to feel the full weight of what the accident had taken and what the years since had cost. A person who was underneath all the competence and the forward movement and the careful professional armor, sometimes afraid, not of the dark or the cold or the mechanical failure, but of the specific and ancient fear of being left on a road and watched by headlights going somewhere else. She had been on that road. She had sat in the dark and counted. And one person had not kept going. That was the whole story. That was all of it. Not the program or the article or the ceremony or the magazine piece, just a man who had looked at a dark road and decided that someone on it mattered enough to slow down, who had not needed a reason beyond the fact of her being there. She had built an emergency fund for people whose equipment failed them. She had answered emails from people who had been on their own versions of that road. She had hired Ryan Walker and watched him change the way her engineers thought about the things they built. She had done all of that, and it had mattered, and it would keep mattering. But the thing that had changed her, the thing that she would carry forward not as a program or a policy, but as something closer to bone, was simpler than any of it. Someone had stopped, in the dark, without being asked, without needing her to be anything other than a person on a road who needed help. She had spent years making herself need less. She understood now that the project had never been about strength. It had been about fear, the specific fear of what happened when you needed something and the world kept going without you. She'd learned that fear at 26 and had been building against it ever since, and it had made her capable and productive and genuinely good at what she did. And it had also made her lonely in the way that people who never ask for anything were lonely, completely, invisibly, and mostly by their own design. She was 30 years old. She had time to do it differently. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything. Lily looked at her from across the table and said, "What are you thinking about?" "Nothing in particular," Victoria said. Lily's eyes narrowed. You're thinking about something. I'm thinking about how pancakes at 8:15 are actually a reasonable idea, and I've been wrong to have opinions about it. Lily considered this. You should just say you were wrong. It's faster. You're right, Victoria said. I was wrong. Lily nodded, satisfied, and turned back to her pancakes. Ryan looked at Victoria across the table with the small, unguarded smile she'd been accumulating in her memory since October. Not collecting it deliberately, just noticing it the way you notice things you didn't want to lose. And she looked back at him and didn't look away. Doris, eating the fries she hadn't wanted, pretended not to notice any of this, which was perhaps the most human thing anyone did all evening. In February, Lily turned 8. She had a party at the house on a Saturday afternoon. 7 kids, 2 of whom cried for unrelated reasons, a cake shaped approximately like a rabbit in honor of Gerald, and a new birdhouse that she and Ryan had finally built from cedar, which she immediately declared the best thing she owned. Victoria came. She brought a field guide to birds, spiral-bound and worn-looking, the kind that had been around long enough to be trustworthy, with Lily's name written inside the front cover in Victoria's careful handwriting. Lily opened it and went directly to the Wren entry and read it with the focused attention of someone adding to an important inventory. They mate for life, Lily said, reading. Some of them, Victoria said. That's good, Lily said, and moved on to the next page. After the kids had gone home and Doris had taken the leftover cake and Ryan was cleaning up in the kitchen, Lily found Victoria in the living room and sat next to her with the easy comfort of a child who had decided that the proximity was normal and didn't require explanation. I'm glad you're here, Lily said. Not performing it, just saying it the way she said most things, directly and without hedging. Victoria looked at her. Me too, she said. Outside, February was cold and specific, the kind of cold that meant the year was still early, that the longer days were coming, but not yet. The birdhouse was in the backyard, cedar pale and new, waiting for wrens that would come in their own time, when the season turned and the world got warm enough to trust again. Ryan came in from the kitchen with a dish towel over his shoulder and stopped in the doorway when he saw them. His daughter and a woman he had stopped for on a dark road in October, sitting side by side on his couch, in the ordinary light of a Saturday afternoon, talking about birds with the easy comfort of people who had already decided to know each other. He stood there for a moment. He did not announce himself. He just stood and let it be what it was. In the years that came after, when people asked Ryan Walker about the night on County Road 17, and people kept asking, the story having that particular staying power of things that touched something true in the people who heard them, he always said the same thing. He said, I just stopped. And people nodded, because it sounded simple. But he knew, and Victoria knew, and Lily would know when she was older, that stopping is never simple. Stopping costs something. It costs us time, and comfort, and the forward momentum of a life that is already complicated and full and running on its own limited reserves. Stopping means looking at something you could have not looked at. Choosing to see when seeing requires you to do something about what you've seen. The world was very good at providing reasons not to stop. The world was full of amber warning lights and empty signal bars, and the particular speed of headlights that didn't slow down. The world had been practicing the art of keeping going for a long time and had gotten very efficient at it. But underneath all of it, underneath the momentum and the busyness and the 1,000 small justifications, there was still County Road 17 in the dark, and a woman counting headlights, and a man who had already had a long day and was tired and hungry and had a daughter at home and who had slowed down anyway. Not because it was easy, because she was there. That was the whole of it. That was the thing that traveled 12,000 shares, and a magazine column and a civic ceremony, and still landed the same way in every person who heard it, because every person who heard it had been on a road like that in some version of their own life, stranded and counting, and hoping that the next set of lights would be different. And some of them, hearing the story, had slowed down, pulled over, stopped. Not all of them, not even most of them, but some. And that in the end was the only kind of legacy that had ever mattered. Not the monument or the ceremony or the name on a program, but the small, specific, uncountable ripple of one ordinary act of decency passing from one person to the next, through time, through darkness, down a long road that never quite ran out.